Welcome back. Have you ever had the experience, after reading a very interesting book, you twiddle your thumbs, unsure of what to read next? I rarely have that experience, and I'd like to tell you about one of the more interesting times in which I finished a book and it led me to reading several more. So I had, after having read both the Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings, I had wondered why in both of these universes, Lewis and Tolkien, erect their universes through the medium and mechanism of music. So if you remember that in the beginning of Narnia, I think it's in The Magician's Nephew when Narnia is first brought into being, it is Aslan who sings it into being. And in the Silmarillion, Tolkien recounts that Eru as well as the Valar sing Middle-earth and all that exists into existence. That the mechanism of creation, rather than what you would perhaps normally attribute to just simply the spoken word in a Judeo-Christian context, you think of in Genesis, let there be light, just the spoken word. Why is it that these two devoutly Christian men, Tolkien and Lewis, both construct their universes not through the spoken word of the deity, but through song, through music? And that single question led me, after having read both of those and wondering, that led me to read, I actually didn't count these, but it led me to read all of these, with the exception of this one, in which I read sections of it. So what is that, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 books, and I think that's actually all of them. So this takes you through, I read, one of the first ones I read was Planet Narnia by Michael Ward. That led me down to reading Hesiod and Theognis, as well as Parmenides and Empedocles. I read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, which is a series of his lectures, I believe, on medieval and Renaissance literature. I also read Cicero, specifically the Somnum Scipionis, Scipio's Dream, as well as the commentary of the Dream of Scipio by Macrobius, who is a medieval writer. I read Plato's Timaeus, which I've talked about numerous times with you. I also read On Plato's Timaeus by Chalcidius, who is another medieval writer. This led me to, again, another medieval writer, Bernardus Sylvestris, and specifically his I don't know exactly how to pronounce this, Cosmographia, but I read that. This got into more contemporary works, contemporary in a very loose sense, but things like Dante's Divine Comedy. So I purchased and read through this commentary, this beginner's guide to Dante's Divine Comedy by Jason M. Baxter. Same author, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, which actually ended up turning me on to several of those other writers, Bernardus Sylvestris, Chalcidius, that sort of thing. And one of the last ones was The Gothic Cathedral. This is by Otto von Simpson. And the subtitle on this is Origins of Gothic Architecture and the Medieval Concept of Order. And it talked a great deal about the philosophy and theology of the medievals when they were constructing specifically Gothic cathedrals and other works of Gothic architecture. So that played a great deal into my question, into answering my question. And I've now dangled that in front of you and showed you all the books that I read. I'm not going to explain the answer. First, because I'm still working through entirely how to explain it well. I think I've incorporated a lot of the information and a lot of the sensibilities, but perhaps maybe need to put down in writing an exact summary and explanation of the answer to my question. That's also further reading if that question strikes you as well. I think I've talked about that in the past. But I bring all of that up, one, to show you those works, also to show you this reading habit, which is when you're reading something, even if it's fiction. It's easier, I think, to do this with nonfiction, where perhaps you're reading some historical account and you want to look, maybe it mentions, a particular conflict or a particular voyage or something like that, and you want to learn more about that. Often nonfiction works will have references in their bibliography that you can go to and read further about that particular thing that stuck out to you. So I highly encourage at least that habit, that sensitivity. But I also wanted to talk about one of the books that I've recently reread, and it would be this, The Discarded Image. This has to be, I haven't read all of C.S. Lewis's books, but this has to be perhaps the one I appreciate the most, or at least has had the most impact on my imagination, and specifically in understanding the way in which the medieval or Renaissance individual saw the cosmos. So again, the subtitle to this is An Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature. C.S. Lewis sets out to explain the way in which the medieval man saw the cosmos differently. And you see this in small little ways that end up being very profound in C.S. Lewis's fictional work. So one of something that I reread this last year was C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy. And in the very first book, Out of the Silent Planet, when they're traveling out of Earth's atmosphere, the narrator, not the narrator, but Ransom has the thought to himself that, he's in outer space now. He's, in this spaceship looking out into outer space, quote unquote. And he is struck by the sentiment that, I think the phrase is that calling what he sees beyond Earth's atmosphere outer space is something akin to a blasphemous libel. I think that's the phrase that Lewis uses. And it's specifically because of all of the light. The sunlight is unimpeded by the atmosphere. The stars, everything's completely black, so you see the stars much more clearly, and that there's, color and, the spaceship is tinkling with, little tiny bits of, space dust, little asteroids and whatnot, and there's the humming for, the spaceships, and he describes all of those sounds as being like rhythmic and musical, the music of the sphere. So that's what he's trying to get at. And just the fact that the medieval person doesn't understand the sentiment of outer space. There was nothing outer. In fact, what we call outer space was further, in the last battle in the Chronicles of Narnia. They say it then, further up and further in. That as you go up and out of Earth's atmosphere, it's Earth that is on the outside, that we are the outer in the cosmos. And so to go to outer space is to go actually further up and further in. And the term space assumes, this vacuous darkness and coldness. But Lewis, again, particularly in his fictional work, and he explains this in The Discarded Image, that the medieval man didn't conceive of, outside Earth's atmosphere as being empty or vacuous. In fact, it was, warm and hot and, planets and stars, and there's, other, aerial and ethereal beings that are, essentially dancing to and fro. So just how richly populated the cosmos was in the medieval mind. And C.S. Lewis goes through and explains, first he explains the model, that cosmological model. We have the model of, the sun in the center of the Milky Way galaxy and the planets revolving around it. All the while, the Milky Way galaxy is, moving through the universe, etc. That's our model, what we talk about, model. In the medieval sentiment, the Earth may have been, if you look at medieval, maps of the cosmos, Earth is at the center, but not in the way in which, we think about Earth being in the center. Earth is really only the center of the medieval cosmos in the way that the, muddy, dirty, moldy bottom of a dark well is the center of the whole. If you're looking down into this well. Earth is the center, but it's also at the bottom. And so in some way, Earth is the least important. And you get that in things like Scipio's dream, where he looks down and sees just the little speck of dust that the Earth is, and then sees even smaller the continent that he lives on, or, Europe, and sees the city that he is a politician in, and just how little it matters in terms of scale. So that was very interesting. It goes over several misconceptions, particularly that we moderns have. One, which I believe I already knew this when I first read this a couple of years ago, that the medievals did not think that the Earth was round. And all the way back to Plato and Ptolemy, they actually had mathematical proofs that the Earth was a sphere. They knew it was not flat. They knew it was not just a disk. They knew it was a sphere. And that got into the question of, okay, well, but why do medieval maps of the Earth, one, why are they two-dimensional? Second, why are the proportions so terrible and so geographically inaccurate? And this has one section on this question of, he talks about in this chapter, Earth and Her Inhabitants, where he talks about this particular issue. And I thought it was interesting enough that maybe I'll just read this, and this goes a little bit further into this information, but this is a good overview, a good explanation for, okay, why are the cartographers so inaccurate in the medieval period? Why are they so terrible? So let me just read this to you, and we'll go from there. Lewis says, the erroneous notion that the medievals were flat earthers was common enough till recently. It might have two sources. One is that medieval maps, such as the great 13th century Mapamund in Hereford Cathedral, represent the Earth as a circle, which is what men would do if they believed it to be a disk. But what would men do if, knowing it was a globe, and wishing to represent it in two dimensions, they had not yet mastered the late and difficult art of projection? Fortunately, we need not answer this question. There's no reason to suppose that the Mapamund represents the whole surface of the Earth. The theory of the four zones taught the equatorial region was too hot for life. The other hemisphere, the southern hemisphere of the Earth, was to us wholly inaccessible. You could write science fiction about it, but not geography. There could be no question of including it in a map. The Mapamundi depicts the hemisphere we live in. The second reason for the error might be that we find in medieval literature references to the world's end. Often these are as vague as similar references in our own time. But they may be more precise, as when in a geographical passage Gower says, "Fro that into the world's end, eastward Asia it is." But the same explanation might cover both this and the Hereford map. The world of man, the only world that can ever concern us, may end where our hemisphere ends. A glance at the Hereford map suggests that 13th century Englishmen were almost totally ignorant of geography. But they cannot have been anything like so ignorant as the cartographer appears to be. For one thing, the British Isles themselves are one of the most ludicrously erroneous parts of his map. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of those who look at it when it was new must at least have known that Scotland and England were not separate islands. The bluebonnets had come over the border too often to permit any such illusion. And secondly, medieval man was by no means a static animal. Kings, armies, prelates, diplomats, merchants, and wandering scholars were continually on the move. Thanks to the popularity of pilgrimages, even women and women of the middle class went far afield. Witness the wife of Bath and Marjorie Kemp. A practical knowledge of geography must have been pretty widely diffused, but it did not, I suspect, exist in the form of maps or even of map-like visual images. It would be an affair of winds to be waited for, landmarks to be picked up, capes to be doubled, this or that road to be taken at a fork. I doubt whether the maker of the Mapamundi would have been at all disquieted to learn that many an illiterate sea captain knew enough to refute his map in a dozen places. I doubt whether the sea captain would have attempted to use his superior knowledge for any such purpose. A map of the whole hemisphere on so small a scale could never have been intended to have any practical use. The cartographer wished to make a rich jewel embodying the noble art of cosmography, with the earthly paradise marked as an island as at the extreme eastern edge. The east is at the top in this, as in other medieval maps, and Jerusalem appropriately in the center. Sailors themselves may have looked at it with admiration and delight, but they were not going to steer by it. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I knew the base fact that they knew the Earth was, a sphere, and they knew how to sail about and traverse the Earth's surface. But I didn't have the background knowledge of, okay, well, but, why are their cartography so inaccurate? And it's because they didn't use maps. The purpose of a map was not to travel by. A world map wasn't so you could get from point A to point B. It was, it said something about their philosophy. And again, it depicted their cosmos, the universe. It was a work of art more than anything else. So that was very interesting. I highly recommend that book to you. As I mentioned recently, I'm also getting into rereading old books that I have. That's been a habit of mine for quite a while. And the one I'll be reading next, I just read a new book. The one I'll be reading next, or rereading I should say, is Planet Narnia. I'd like to just rehash some of the information in it. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and at least you have some good book recommendations. Again, and if you are now puzzled by the same question that I was puzzled by, I encourage you to read those works yourself. But also I'll perhaps work on solidifying and perhaps writing down in a more constructive, succinct way rather than me simply just rambling, and perhaps I'll share that with you sometime. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. And as is our custom, I would like to read a poem, and it's actually from the beginning of this book, Planet Narnia. It's something like a prescript on here. And this is a poem by Joseph Addison. I think it's, I don't know that there's a title, but he's written this poem in sort of his own imaginative telling of Psalm 19. So I hope you enjoy this, and here we go. The spacious firmament on high, with all the blue ethereal sky and spangled heavens a shining frame, their great original proclaim. The unwearied sun from day to day does his Creator's power display, and publishes to every land the work of an almighty hand. Soon as the evening shades prevail, the moon takes up the wondrous tale, and nightly to the listening earth repeats the story of her birth, whilst all the stars that round her burn, and all the planets in their turn, confirm the tidings as they roll, and spread the truth from pole to pole. What though in solemn silence all move round the dark terrestrial ball? What though no real voice nor sound amid their radiant orbs be found? In reason's ear they all rejoice, and utter forth a glorious voice, forever singing as they shine, the hand that made us is divine. Again, that's a poem by Joseph Addison after Psalm 19. I hope you enjoyed that. As always, it was good to see you again, and thank you for keeping me company. Until next time.